Hi, good morning. First of all, I want to say that I'm very happy to be here in Sydney. It's my first time in Australia. I'm from the USA. And I came here to talk a little bit about one of my passions, which is Vue.js. So I first looked at Vue.js a few years ago, and I had already been through a lot of different JavaScript tooling and frameworks and had what they call JavaScript fatigue at that time, so I didn't pursue it. I had done quite a bit of consulting work for Backbone, React, Angular, among other things. And so I wasn't overly enthusiastic when I first saw it. And then I started hearing that Vue.js was the new jQuery, that it was so usable, so easy to teach. And because I also teach JavaScript, I've had a lot of pains in trying to explain various concepts and state management and things to people who are newer in development. So I decided to take a stab at it again. And I realized, even though I was already content with React and had been using it for a while, that Vue.js is also a good framework. It uses a lot of the same good ideas, the virtual DOM, but it's much simpler and easier to use and teach. And so today I aim to explore why the Vue.js framework, or why I have chosen Vue.js above other frameworks and tools. And also, perhaps you will agree with some of my points that I make, but in any case, I hope to convey why it's the fastest growing JavaScript framework of all time and why there's so much hype over it. So my name's Gwen. I'm from the US. I live in the Midwest right now, and I am very passionate about developer education. I think that's one of the biggest inequalities in Western society and perhaps in the world is access to education. So right now I work with a startup called Crossroads, where we hire people to teach them and let them learn while they're being paid, and then they can grow with us. I've also been part of the Free Code Camp community for over 3 years, writing articles, contributing, mentoring. It's a really phenomenal community for coders of all levels. And I run a local group in the USA to help teach people, support people, and encourage people as they learn to code, because it's not easy for people of any level. So the itinerary for what I want to talk about today is, since it's a newer framework, and especially the stats show in Australia, it's a bit underrepresented here, and React is way overrepresented. So I'm going to go over some of the basic syntax and how it's used, but not get too much into that. And it's not really going to be an advanced talk. It's more of a 10,000-foot overview of the ecosystem and how things work. So what is Vue.js? I think it's important to understand some of the history behind Vue, and you can then understand the goals and use cases of the framework. So it was created in 2013, or it was launched in 2013, but it was created by a former Google engineer named Evan You. He had previously worked heavily with Angular on the Google teams, and he was part of a creative labs team that had to spin up new interesting solutions and projects all the time. So he was really looking for something that was easy to use in the front end for rapid prototyping, and he couldn't find anything that was lightweight, could be incrementally adoptable, and was easy enough to use. So he kind of took the best things from a lot of other frameworks, from Angular and React, which had just come out recently at the time, and Facebook had been working on it for a few years internally though, and the ease of use of jQuery, and combine them all into one framework. And you might think it's going to be a mess just having so many things in one framework, but he actually took a lot of good ideas, because a lot of frameworks had good ideas, and that's why they were adopted. So Vue has kind of combined all of these good ideas, combined with ease of use and good documentation, and that's why it's spreading so fast right now. So some of the main features of Vue.js is that it offers a simple syntax to use more complicated functionality. It borrowed, or it stole, really, directives from Angular, A directive is like a special markup token that links something in your JavaScript to a DOM element. But in Vue, the concept of a directive is much, much simpler than its implementation in Angular. And it also uses two-way data binding. So you can either use it as a directive in your HTML using vbind, which will bind and update the DOM whenever that data updates. Or you can use a knockout-like syntax with double curly braces, and it will parse anything inside double curly braces as JavaScript and then render it to the DOM. The concept of Vue is similar to React. It's a lot of modular components. If you've used React before, I think it's probably much more common to have React experience. So React, you're basically taking all these files, which are components, and you're rendering your HTML or your Vue from your JavaScript. So Vue is very similar in where it's broken up by file into component, and at the top of the file you have your HTML template, and then which is just standard HTML5 syntax. There's nothing new made by Vue here. They're using a lot of common web standards, which makes it really nice and simple for new people coming into the framework as well. And then you have your script tag below in the same file, which anything inside, of course, is parsed as JavaScript, and that will be your data and methods and everything associated with your Vue or with your JavaScript. And then you can also put your styling in your same file. You can either scope it or just have it in the related styling in the same file, and then it will be compiled all into one style sheet if you want. It's very flexible. You can choose to use, instead of HTML, you could use JavaScript, or you could use Pug or even JSX if you wanted to. It has built-in support for TypeScript, and for your styles, it's very easy to just say, I want to lang equals Sass or lang equals less, or whatever kind of meta language you want to work. So it's a very simple implementation using a lot of web standards that are already out there, which also makes it a much lighter weight framework and easier for people to adopt. And when you look at these web standards from HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, they've been heavily researched and built up over the years. So Vue didn't want to reinvent a lot of things. It wanted to kind of use what was already out there and just implement it into a nice framework style where it would have a clean syntax and you could build all of your components in a standard way. And just like other frameworks out there now, it basically takes all of your components that have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and puts them into one file, and then it will render it to your DOM. So you create a new Vue instance object, and the L there stands for element, which is the DOM element that your Vue instance will be attached to. So it's the element with the ID of app, and then you basically render your parent component from your tree of components into that DOM element. Pretty standard. So, and you'll have the HTML file that has the ID of app, and you link your bundle.js. So what's special about Vue? First of all, not everyone realizes this, I think, coming into programming, but frameworks and tools and all these abstractions that we use, they are actually made for people, not for machines. So the number one thing that I think sets Vue apart from every other framework and tool out there is that its number one focus is on the developers and designers who are going to be using the framework. And this can be seen across all areas of Vue. If you look at what the statements made by the core team, to the naming conventions of the framework, the tooling, the code style, the documentation, everything is built around this concept of accessibility, not over-engineering for really smart people, which makes it a really nice user experience for people of all levels. So I want to go over some of the ways that they make it kind of easier to use. It's a super legible, declarative framework, and as a consultant for a while now, I find Vue is way easier to jump into a code base because of the naming and conventions and styles and everything. And sometimes with other frameworks, I've had huge headache just wondering, especially older frameworks, wondering what was going on when I jumped in there. So I think Vue brings a lot to the table in terms of ease of use and implementation. It's also self-documenting in a way because it is so legible, which is really nice, and you don't have to clutter up your code with comments because you can just kind of read it and understand what it's doing. And it feels like it abstracts away a lot of the things that you feel like you've done a million times, and but you can also customize it as much as you want to because you're right there almost at the level of the underlying JavaScript and HTML and everything. So let's look at starting a Vue app. So just like most frameworks in JavaScript, you can start by including it. The easiest way to include it in the CDN, and you can kind of drop it into any project, which makes it maybe the most modular, adoptable framework out there, or one of them. And then, like I showed earlier, you have an element with an ID where you're going to render your Vue instance. And your Vue instance, you'll create this new Vue object, basically, as your Vue instance. And you'll pass it options. The first option that has to be passed is which DOM element to render, or where to render your Vue instance. And then it has something called the data object. So the data, any property in the data object will be linked, can be linked into your DOM directly by putting it in the curly braces or by binding it to your DOM with a directive. And you can just call it by its name, and Vue under the hood understands that, hey, you want something from the data object in your DOM. And then the DOM will update whenever you change something in the Vue. Yeah, so you can also bind things with a directive, which I think is super legible how they built their directives in Vue. And they also have a lot of easy shortcuts. So if instead of writing out vbind:source, you can just write out :source, and any HTML attribute, you can put a colon before it, and that means it will be controlled by the Vue JavaScript, which is also easy to read. And for inputs, it's very easy to do the two-way data binding. You can just use the vModel attribute on your inputs, and then in your data, declare whatever variable you want to model it after. And now in the data object, name will automatically update as a user types in. And for events, it's also quite easy to handle events and to link them up to your JavaScript. You can use a vOn directive, and then all of the standard HTML events will be there for you to use, like key up, on click, mouse over, all of those standard events. And there are also things called modifiers in Vue. So the .13, the .enter, all of those are modifiers that you put onto the event. So the enter key has the key code of 13, where you can just use the word enter, and Vue knows that, hey, when this event happens, when the enter key is pressed, then I'll run this function called submit. And you can also chain these, so you could do keyup.enter.prevent. Now prevent, you can probably tell from reading it, is prevent default. So a lot of very common things that developers do whenever you're writing in a function that's triggered by an event, you almost always use, e.prevent.default or prevent default. You also use stop propagation, so you could also chain .stop there, and so on and so on. You can chain as many things. And it's done in a really clear fashion, and also the shortcut for events because they're used so frequently. Instead of v on colon, you can just use at and then the event name, like at keyup, which is also super legible and readable. Even if you hadn't used Vue before, I think you could figure out what it was doing there. And so this is just an example of how the function is run. So you have a data object, and you also have a methods object. And so Vue will look for things with the name submit inside of those. So it sees there's a method called submit, and it will run that method whenever that event occurs. And this is just an example. If you you can do an @click event. It will also run submit. And you can access anything in your data object from your JavaScript just by doing this dot the name of your data attribute. So you could say this dot name will grab the name from your data that's modeled to your user input, and then you can use that in your JavaScript. So it's a very simple way to use the data. And then here are some more directives, which can also be chained. So v-if, v-else-if, v-else. It's pretty obvious what those are doing. They're conditionally rendering. v-show will keep something in the DOM but toggle the display, which is much more performant if you're going to be toggling it a lot. There's also v-for, of course, that will loop through arrays and display things. So everything is super readable. And lifecycle. Now this is a very commonly used use case in building SPAs today. And just from reading it, you can tell what it's doing. You don't have to guess what the name is. It's like jQuery when you want to use a function, but the API is so big for all these libraries, but you can just say, oh, I think it's .show, and it's exactly what you thought it was. But it's the same with Vue. Whenever you're trying to think of what the function name is, then, oh, created, that makes sense. It's not should component update or will mount or a lot more confusing terminology used in other libraries. And then, of course, you can tell from the tense here that it's something that happened in the past, meaning the component was already created, that it was already updated. It also has pre-event functions. So it just changes the tense and adds a before. Again, super legible, super easy to understand what's going on. So instead of created, it's before create. That makes perfect sense. And then there are many other functions that you can use in Vue that help with the speed and with basically making it more performant as a whole that they added in. So computed functions, just real quick, like the greeting function is actually cached, but it's watching the inputs that are used inside that return statement. So whenever the user updates title or name, it will actually rerun that function and then cache it, which is really nice for expensive functions that you're not re-rendering it all the time, but just when the input updates, which I thought was super cool because if it's a computed function, it's automatically watching any of the data that's used inside that function, which makes something complicated quite easy to use. So animations are also a big part of Vue. I actually recently took a few animations workshops by Sarah Jasner. She's a member of the core team. And she gave a really good example of how in real life things don't just appear and disappear. Like to get here, I had to walk up on stage. And this is what we're used to just as humans, as people. So things just naturally transition. So that's a very important part of UX, is to have transitions. So Vue actually gives a lot of great built-in transition functionality that's just built into the framework. So here you can wrap any DOM element or a group of elements in a transition wrapper, but the transition element won't render to the page. All it's doing is creating a kind of a watcher with name of fade. So whenever it's active, it's going to run these classes. So it will run the name of the transition enter active, or the name of the transition leave active, and there's 6 different transition classes that it will automatically run based off of the state of the transition. And she goes into way more depth than me, so if you're interested in animations, she goes really deep into not only these kind of animations, but also how keyframe animations can be used in Vue.js, which was really awesome because I never considered myself much of a designer before, but I was able to make some cool things. So learning the basics is all well and good, and unfortunately that's where a lot of tools and libraries leave it. They'll give you like this hello world example and then go figure it out for yourself. But Vue, I think, does a really good job of helping you at every stage of development. And so if you're starting out with Vue, of course the best place to go is the docs. And the docs are actually audited over and over again by members of the core team and community for their ease of user understanding. And they said that it was because they wanted even the newest developers or people who maybe didn't speak the language that well that they could just jump in and understand. And it doesn't just cover the basics, by the way. It also goes really in depth on how components work, how animations work, about scaling your Vue application. And so it has copy-paste ready examples, complete API, which is super awesome, and also includes common mistakes to avoid. And then after you kind of graduate from the guide, there's also the cookbook, which is a great addition. It's in beta right now. It's been out for a little while, and they have a lot of real-world examples that they call recipes inside the cookbook. Things like how to use GraphQL in your Vue app, how unit testing works, form validation, and any number of other things. And they opened it up to the community, and they gave kind of a boilerplate, hey, here's how you should make your Vue recipes for the cookbook, and it should follow this standard. This is how to make it readable, and then they will review it and kind of help you with it for quality and consistency, which is really nice. From there are lots of great workshops put out by the core team, which I thought this was really amazing. They put a lot of work into onboarding people into the framework. So they put out amazing workshops. This is just 3 of the core team members, and I thought they've put out some really high quality material, but there are many others. They put out lots of training content, and they also host live Q&As in their chat frequently. It's a Discord chat room. So the ecosystem is very important, and in Vue, it's very, very lively. They try to give you enough tooling so you're not reinventing any wheels, so to speak. The most common part of the ecosystem, or just building any SPA, is probably routing. It's something that you just can't avoid. And I think one of the best decisions, one thing I'm very happy about with Vue, is that they make routing, it's a separate package, but it's controlled by the core team and the core project. So this allows it to maintain all the same focuses of the regular Vue.js project, and also be reliably included in Vue DevTools, in the Vue CLI, and in the official documentation. And it still allows for optional use and keeping with the modular design of Vue. So I'm just going to give an example of how easy it is to use Vue Router. I don't know if this is easy to see, but you just import Vue and you import Router, and then whatever components you want to render in the different routes. You use a very simple syntax to attach it to your Vue instance. It's just Vue.use router. It's very easy. And then you create a new router object, and you pass it basically a routes array. So your routes array will be just objects telling it what path you want your route to have, what name you want your route to have, which component that route is tied to. And you can have as many routes as you want. And then you just import that router into your main Vue instance as router, and your router works. It's so easy to use. And there are also lots of other functionality you can use with the router. Some of the most common things are setting history mode. If you have a server set up and you want to get rid of that hashtag / syntax, and also scroll behavior. In SPAs, it doesn't always scroll to the top when you're navigating routes, so you can just set it to scroll to the top if that's the functionality that you want. And then for routes, it gives you some easy ways to do all of the common things you're probably going to do. Redirects, you just pass it a redirect object and tell it which route you want it to redirect to. You can also use that for authentication. If you have child routes, you just pass it an array of child routes. It uses a lot of just standard JavaScript that you're used to seeing. So it doesn't have a really high learning curve for any of these tools. The next most common thing, and something I've never worked in a professional app without, is state management. So I've used a ton of Redux and some of Angular's internal state management and some hacked internal projects. And just like with Vue Router, the core team also maintains Vuex, which is part of the official Vue umbrella. And I've had a lot of headaches teaching new developers how to use Redux. They just did not understand Redux. And I've talked to Dan Abramov online. He's a very nice person, but I don't think he put, or the people behind Redux put, the usability and onboarding first in their implementation, even though it had some good ideas behind it. So this is from a tweet, I think, someone trying to learn Redux, which basically speaks for itself. So Vuex is trying to simplify this whole world of state management and all the craziness. So just like Vue Router, you use the Vue.use syntax, and you pass it Vuex. Say you want to use Vuex with this app. And then you create a new Vuex store object. On this object, you'll have your state, which is your initial state, and your getters, mutations, actions, which are all the functions used to interact with your store. And then if you want to modularize your store, maybe your store's growing, you have a lot of different parts of the store, you can separate them as modules and just create kind of all these sub-view stores, which is a really easy to use concept, and I love the design of it. And also external plugins are very easy. You just import the plugin and you put it in the plugins array, and it works. And then you'll just, on your Vue instance, you'll just import this the same way and say store, I want to use this as store on the Vue instance, which is super easy. This is how you set the initial state. So you can, anything that's valid object syntax in JavaScript will be valid on the initial state. And if you want to interact with your store on your components, there's no additional setup needed. All you have to do is access this $store, and you can access your state, your getters, mutations, basically anything you put on your store, any function or bit of data, you can access through this. And it also gives you a few other helper methods to be able to access this. But this is the most basic way to interact with your store. Vue CLI. So this is, I think, the biggest part of JavaScript fatigue is setting up applications. And I've had this headache working in React for a long time, and with lots of other things. I think it was mostly Webpack. And this tooling has been a major frustration for a lot of people. It's basically a nightmare if you have to spend days or a week setting up your app, and you have to set up your dev and your prod environment. And then there's the linting and transpiling, and there's so many other things going on in the JavaScript world, and it's just so frustrating. This is a famous tweet, just an example, that it just took so much effort just to get the hello world ready. Of course, React has tried to mitigate this, creating the Create React app, which took quite a while to come out, but I guess it works much better now. But I think Vue made some very good design decisions in making it very easy and simple to just start using it. So they have something called Vue CLI. Version 3 actually came out recently, earlier this year. And all you have to do is globally install Vue CLI, and then Vue CLI create my project. And it takes you through this kind of easy step-by-step way of creating your project. You can pick just a default build and it'll do everything for you, or you can manually select features, which is probably what you're going to be doing. And from there, these are probably the most common things that are the biggest pain to set up, like CSS preprocessing, your state management, routing, TypeScript, all these other things, even your testing, it will automatically set up for you. It asks you a few more questions based off of what you choose, like you can choose Mocha or Jest or a few things like that. And then you also have the option to save that as a preset for the future. So then you can initialize future projects. If you're prototyping a lot, that might be really useful. And one more thing that they did was create a GUI where maybe you're not familiar with the terminal, or especially newer people or designers coming into the development world are a lot less familiar with the terminal. So they wanted it to be usable for everybody. So I thought this was a really awesome thing that I would have never thought of. It's a friendly UI which does the same thing. If you type in Vue UI in your terminal, then it pops up with this GUI. And it does the same thing that the terminal does. You can pick where you want to store your project, what you want to name it, and then it gives you all of the same options that you had in the CLI. So do you want TypeScript support and all these other things, and then it will just set up the project for you. And then I think, I'm not sure, but they might have functionality to run it from the GUI now. I'm not sure if that's in there yet. So Vue also has official dev tools for Firefox and Chrome, and people also say they use it in Safari, but I'm not sure how that works. I don't think that's officially supported. And the Vue dev tools is super easy because the naming is very good, and I think the layout and just the UX of the whole thing is very nice. And this is where part of the importance of having the routing as a main package, as just a standard package, comes into play, because it works very well with things like the dev tools. It has a lot of built-in functionality where you can not just look at your data and kind of navigate around it, but it has a lot of functionality around using Vue Router, and also there's a tab built into the official dev tools for Vuex, which gives you a lot of very easy to use options. Of course, you can do standard things that you could do with the Redux tools, but I think it's just easier to use. You can record things. One cool feature is that you can export your entire state object, and then for testing you can import it later to use, which is really nice. And then it has all of the different scrubbing and going back and forth in state and all of those standard features. The community is one of the main reasons I think Vue is becoming so popular now. So they've gone really out of their way to make it a very welcoming place for everybody. And they have a lot of different tools to get to know Vue and to interact with the community as well. The forum is quite active. They have a place where you can post new projects that you built in Vue and get feedback. They have a very active chat room on Discord chat. If you haven't used Discord, it has a beautiful UI for chat, and a lot of developer and I guess gaming communities are on there too. And I just want to point out, there's links to all the meetups and GitHub projects and everything. There's a Vue meetup in Sydney. Actually, I'm assuming most of you are somewhat local. And it's quite active. I was surprised. It has about 60 to 100 people going to their monthly meetups, which is a lot more than where I'm from, which is awesome. So definitely check that out. They'll have a meetup in the next month or so. They hadn't scheduled it yet. And this is just the show and tell I mentioned earlier, so you can post your projects that you build in Vue and get feedback from very nice people. And of course, just as a standard in the front-end world, there's a lot of activity on CodePen around Vue, so you can see a lot of what people are building, get examples of different parts of an application. Maybe you want to know how to build some type of form or implement loading or something like that. There's thousands of projects about Vue on CodePen now. And oh yeah, JS Fiddle gives you a boilerplate starter for Vue. So if you go to jsfiddle.net, make sure you don't type in .com, and jsfiddle.net will give you just a standard starting place with a to-do application if you wanted to play around with Vue, which is nice. If you want more to the application of file structure, there's another online tool. So this is codesandbox.io, and they also have online sandboxes for other things. I know they have React. I'm not sure what else they have, but they have a starter Vue app which gives you all of your files and folder structure as well. So then you can start building out components and really see how a Vue application would work, similar to how it would be if you were to start an application with the CLI. And I thought this was a really interesting community site. Vue jobs, you can see job postings from around the world. I want to point out that Vue of course, has less job opportunities than other frameworks right now, but it's growing more rapidly than any other framework. So I think that will change in the next year or two. But there are quite a few new postings on here and on other sites that I saw. And even locally where I live in the US, there's quite a bit of activity and buzz around Vue. Everyone wants to try it out. So why is Vue great for companies? Of course, you know developers are expensive. They're sometimes hard to find. There's a lot of onboarding and training costs, and then there's the maintainability of the code, which is also costly. So all of these things play into why Vue is great. If you've read the book Clean Code, which I think a lot of developers have, Uncle Bob Martin mentions that the ratio of time reading code versus writing is well over 10 to 1, and he goes on to argue it's closer to 100 or 1,000 to 1. And so it's very important when you're choosing your tooling, is it going to be something that's easy to onboard new developers and for them to make it a maintainable code base where many different people are going to be jumping in and out of. These are some of the stats for the cost of developers. These are in US dollars, so it's a little bit more in Australia or less, I'm not sure. But it's about $40,000 to hire and onboard a developer, including HR costs and things. If you're paying them a $90K salary plus benefits and $22,000 for 3 months of training, that's very expensive. And then if developers aren't happy, they'll just on average leave in a year or two. So I think that companies should consider developer experience a lot more than they do. And I think by using Vue, which I'll show some of the charts of how developers like Vue later, but it gives you a larger pool of applicants to choose from as well, because it's easier for people to get started with it and they can more easily jump into it. And since, according to the Stack Overflow and not every other, but other surveys about development, developers heavily skew young and inexperienced. So that's one thing to consider when you're choosing a technology as well, is will young and inexperienced people be able to understand and grasp this? It's not just for the person who has 10 years of experience. So this is just some charts about what developers and companies think about Vue. Unfortunately, a lot of the stats for Vue came out, they're from 2016 or 2017, because we haven't finished 2018 yet, so they're not quite there. But you can see the fourth one from my left is Vue.js with the largest dark yellow block. And that is basically people who would love to try Vue.js. There's also some people who haven't heard of Vue.js, but it's way down from 2016, the previous year. And Vue.js, when you look at the numbers, has the highest ratio of people who have tried it and would use it again. React is similar, but other than React and Vue, there isn't another framework that has a good ratio of people who tried it and would like to use it again. And then another problem that some people have with Vue, they say, well, Vue is not backed by a large company, so I shouldn't use it. But as this cartoon kind of funnily says, it doesn't really matter. There's been lots of projects that come and go backed by large companies, and that's not a very good indication of how successful a project will be if it's just made by Google or Facebook. You have to look into a lot more things, I think. On top of that, Vue is heavily endorsed by some major companies, especially in China. Evan Yu is Chinese, so I think he's very well connected in the China community. And so Alibaba and some other companies started picking up Vue early on, and it's just kind of moving to the West right now. 2017, we saw a huge explosion of Vue in westernized countries. So some signs that you're choosing a good framework is that it's at least a few years old, so you can kind of tell, how it's going to go. Have there been consistent improvements in the framework? Is there a good communication between the core team and the users and the community as a whole? And are there lots of good projects and tooling being consistently built and maintained around it? Some not so good signs, of course. If innovation slows, they make a new version that's maybe not backwards compatible with the old version, everything breaks, they don't communicate it very well. Or if the docs are hard to read and there's a high learning curve, I think that's a very bad sign of adoptability of a framework. Here are some kind of comical charts to kind of illustrate if you should use a framework. So this is basically, there's always going to be an initial learning curve just for any tool or framework. And then it becomes stable. And then after a few years, there are no changes, no updates, and then it just bombs and dies out, and everybody abandons the project because there were no new updates. I think that's why it's important to wait a few years and see if there's constant innovation. Then there's also a major framework that kind of did this. There's a huge initial learning curve, and then they come out with version 2, and it's completely different. And everything breaks. It's not backwards compatible at all, and they didn't communicate things very well. So a lot of people just jumped ship or started not really having faith in the project anymore. Maybe they're just going to break things every time. So a very bad sign with a framework. So this is more of a good sign. You have your initial learning curve. which isn't too steep. And then with every new major version, you'll have a new small learning curve, but no major breaking API changes, nothing that makes it look like an entirely new framework. And developers are happy. So I think Vue has been following this pattern. The API is pretty much similar with good improvements every single time. And so this next chart I made a long time ago, which is a bit exaggerated, but I think it's still a good indication of what framework to choose. So I think ease of use and continued innovation are two of the most important metrics. And this is why jQuery was adopted so quickly, because it made all these hard things like HTTP calls and kind of navigating around the DOM so simple and easy, just dead simple to use. And Vue does the exact same thing for SPAs. So I think if you haven't tried it, you should at least give it a try and see if it makes sense for your team or project. So some stats on Vue adoption now. Of course, GitHub stars are not the best metric, but you can see it's comparable with React and activity on GitHub when you look at watch stars, forks, all of those things. Issues are closed a little bit faster than any other framework, I think, which is good. And there's a lot of activity on the issues. And these numbers become a lot more impressive when you put them in perspective to the state of Vue a few years ago. So the number of GitHub stars in 2016 was 7.6 thousand. 2017 it was 37,000, and 2018, as of a few days ago, it was 114,000. So it's just growing by orders of magnitude in popularity now. And I think over the last year it's been the most starred project on GitHub, or at least the most starred JavaScript project. For NPM downloads, you can see a similar trajectory, only it's even steeper. Well under 1 million in 2016. These are total downloads. 1.78 million in 2017, and now just to date in 2018, it's already at 13 million. And also for dev tools. Now this was an interesting metric that I haven't seen really used before to denote how many active users a project has. But Evan, you shared this earlier this year at his State of Vue address he gives every year. And I think this is a really good indication of how people are actually using the project. So this is through April or May, there were over 355,000 active users compared to 84,000 last year. So it's also growing in popularity with a lot of active projects. And for 2016 through part of 2017, Vue, aside from Preact, which is a little red dot up there, Vue was the most, I guess, or grew the most out of any different JavaScript framework. And I think by now, it's been over a year since then, so I think it's in the second or third block to the right, and it will probably overtake Angular and jQuery pretty soon. I don't see it overtaking React soon, and that's just because React is in so many different verticals. People are using it more and more in VR, and people have been using it in IoT, and then there's React Desktop and React Mobile. React Native is quite popular, which also uses the React standard library. Now, Vue did come out with native script. Vue came out with 1.0 earlier this year, and it looks like a really good implementation, and they also have desktop implementations, but all of those things are still a lot more immature than the React ecosystem, so we'll see where things go. I think that's important to point out because a lot of people choose React because they can also build with React Native, but I think Vue Native Script is a very promising tool. Native Script has been out for a long time, and they've done quite a good job of giving you 100% mobile API coverage just from your JavaScript. And they also claim that I've used React Native quite extensively, And if you're doing more complicated things, you do have to use Swift or some underlying Java and kind of embed native code inside your JavaScript. So the claim of native script is that you'll be doing that a lot less, but I haven't tried out that claim yet. And I'm going to wrap it up with one of my favorite quotes by Sarah Drasner about Vue, which seems to describe the Vue community very well. That Vue is just a lot of fun. It feels like a breath of fresh air in all this mess of JavaScript land, and it makes a lot of difficult things easier. I'm going to tweet out all the slides later at Gwen_Faraday, and I have a list of resources here, people, different ways to get started to Vue, the Vue Sandbox and Starter. Some podcasts you should check out. They do their official news in a podcast form and in a text form. And then here's a good link to a framework comparison. Basically, it's a build of a to-do app in every different framework, or almost all of them. So it has, React, Angular, React, all of those different frameworks. And there's a good example of how Vue kind of compares line by line of code to all the other frameworks there. Here are some good related Vue projects. So I'm actually building a blockchain solution right now in Vue Desktop Vuedo. There's also server-side rendering, which is a really good project that's quite advanced in Vue. And like I said before, native script Vue. And there's also an initial implementation of Vue VR, but I don't know anyone who's used it yet. I think it's still experimental. So yeah, this is me. If you want to reach out to me, contact me for any reason or give me feedback, just let me know. So thanks for coming. If you want to come up and ask questions, you can do so individually, I guess. So, thank you.